bad headlines is just the tip of the iceberg. Boeing is battling very serious internal issues. It's facing a huge financial crisis as a result of all this, all these incidents. Most analysts believe that Boeing is going to have to spend the next 1 decade repairing the damage that has been done to its reputation. Boeing had put in a software patch to correct the aircraft's nose attitude without telling the companies that they've put that software patch. The reason they did not tell the companies that they had put the software patch is because it would have meant recertification, it would have meant mandatory retraining of pilots on that system, it would have meant declarations of all kinds to the Federal Aviation Authority, to the National Transport Security Board, etc., and to a wide variety of American agencies saying the plane is not the same, it is different, and we've made all these changes. And that would have meant a cost to airlines. Sounds innocuous, sounds kind of fancy, but it was a murderous piece of software that Boeing basically did not tell its pilots about. It was a life and death piece of software that was ironically built to actually save the plane from a kind of stall situation where it starts falling out of the sky, but ended up being the reason for those aircraft crashing into the ground. Would you believe that the Federal Aviation Authority is actually populated by people appointed by aviation companies? Either people who are from those companies or people appointed by those companies, which means that the people who are overseeing and regulating you are your own people. It's like you correcting your own examination sheet.
Hello and welcome to the 25th episode of ANA Defense. The rains have hit south of India while the north is still, reeling under a heat wave. Hi Shiv, I don't know if you saw that viral clip that went viral yesterday for BSF Jawan somewhere in Rajasthan. He roasted a papad just on the sand, put a piece of papad on the sand and just roasted.
I've actually done that on the front part of a T-90 tank in Rajasthan.
Wow.
So there is no exaggeration about that kind of heat. I happen to think that we could probably do that even here in the Delhi region. They've given the last few days. So yeah, absolutely. That kind of heat is real.
Yeah. So I don't think we should be complaining much. I mean, we are privileged enough to be living in AC houses, driving AC cars, and working in air-conditioned offices. It's terrible for people who have to
absolutely
work outdoors at the entire day. Right. Before we begin this episode, a short announcement for our listeners and viewers. We'll be taking a break of 2 weeks. Elections are coming up. The results are coming up. D-Day, and it's going to be very, very hectic for both Shiv and I because we run newsrooms online and on television. So for that space for us to be able to do our day jobs and ensure we don't get fired by this company, we'll need to take 2 weeks break. So we'll be back in the week after the results are announced. The results will be announced on June 4. June 6 would normally be a day when we released, which would be a Thursday, but we'll be skipping that as well. And we'll be back the week after that. But don't worry, we'll definitely be back. As we take this break, let's kind of move away from the world of defense. Not exactly, but kind of, because I want to talk about this storied fabled company, Boeing, of the United States. It's been in the news for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, constantly in the headlines for the last few years, actually.
I think their PR department must be having sleepless nights. I don't think they must have slept in a while. We'll get into the problems that face this company. Some of which should be blamed on Boeing itself. They've made some terrible mistakes. As we record this, just a day before, I think there was a death on a Singapore Airlines flight that faced turbulence. It was a Boeing plane. Though in this case, Boeing has got nothing to do with it.
Yes.
Turbulence is just like, it's something that will happen on airplanes. And what happened in this case was a very, very unfortunate death. A very rare scenario. Doesn't really happen. And probably happened because the seatbelt wasn't fastened. The turbulence was really bad. I think breakfast was being served, etc. You can't fault the manufacturer for that. But I don't think Boeing would have been very happy about its name.
No, because it simply adds to the list of negative headlines and tragic headlines involving Boeing. Doesn't help at all.
But before we get into all the negativity about Boeing, let's talk a bit positive. I want to talk about the Boeing C-17 Globemaster III, which is operated by the Indian Air Force. And the reason we're talking about Boeing is, like Shiv was telling us before we decided the topic, is that Boeing is closely linked to India's defense apparatus because they supply a lot of helicopters and the Globemaster. I've always wondered, whenever there is a tweet about the Globemaster by defense journalists like you or by the Indian Air Force, it's written in a way कि it's just given कि everyone knows it's a very cool aircraft. There are always adjectives कि भाई फाड़ू aircraft है, badass. But no one has ever explained to me what is it about this aircraft that makes it so cool. It's like I've seen it. It's huge. I've read a bits and pieces about it, but no one's really gotten into it. Ki what is it about the C-7 Globemaster III, which by the way is based a few kilometers away from here, Hindon Air Base from Noida, where we work. What is it about this aircraft? Why are you, a journalist, a defense journalist, so fascinated by it?
No, so I'm first of all, I'm really glad we're discussing Boeing because Boeing is a company that no country can ignore. It's a huge company, and anything that it does or anything that happens to Boeing has a ripple effect across the world because it is one of the two dominant aviation companies, civil aviation companies, and also really big in defense. So while we are sort of shifting away from in our defense as a core topic, your question about the C-17 actually sort of clarifies that in a big way, Dave. And we actually aren't even shifting away from defense because Boeing happens to be one of India's biggest suppliers of, defense aircraft and helicopters, munitions and, military hardware in general. It has been one of our biggest suppliers. So, the reputation and and the condition of what's happening in Boeing has very much to do with Indian, anxieties as far as, supply lines, national security are concerned. So it's a good thing that we're discussing Boeing because it actually has everything to do with what we discuss here on In Our Defense. Coming to the C-17, you're right. I've been very privileged and lucky enough to not only see C-17s in action, but fly in them many different times. And on one very memorable occasion, in a United States C-17, I flew in the cockpit with the pilots. So I was in the jump seat behind the pilots. I was given permission to do that entire sortie sitting there. That was for today. So we have a full video of that entire shoot as well. Absolutely fabulous aircraft. The reason why people rave about the C-17 so much, I gather, is because, when people think of big, brutish military transport aircraft, unlike sexy light fighters, one thinks of a big, hulking, beast of an aircraft that is not very agile, it just does the job in a very kind of prosaic manner and has no real poetry about it. The C-17 really turns that reputation on its head. It's an extremely agile aircraft. It's an aircraft that's been built for very, very short takeoffs. If you see it in the air, especially during aerial displays, it has a crazy amount of agility for its size in the air. It has a very steep rate of turn, which is actually pretty scary when you're in the aircraft because that's the kind of thing you usually see in light aircraft and fighters and things. This thing has a really tight and steep turn, has a very high rate of climb. So it's a really agile beast for the huge imposing size that it has. So it's an amazing aircraft. It's also been built to land on unprepared runways. It can land on sort of muddy surfaces as well. So everything about it just shouts American power projection. This is the aircraft that's been used across the world to deliver troops, but we in India know the C-17 even better as a humanitarian aircraft, because that's what it's been used for. Apart from training for war and things like that, we've seen them go to Afghanistan to bring back people from Kabul, very recently when the Taliban took over. We've seen them, operate out of Wuhan to bring our people back from Wuhan just before the pandemic kicked in. We've seen them, deliver cyclone and flood relief to all parts of Africa, all parts of Southeast Asia. Function in a huge way here in India. During demonetization, they were carrying banknotes to different parts of the country. So these are amazing aircraft. I would say in many ways that the C-17 is actually sexier than a fighter in some ways. Yeah,
that's a big statement to make, actually. So let's move to the company, Boeing. We'll obviously get into the infamous MAX issues that the Boeing faced. MAX, not maximum, MAX, the aircraft build that they built a few years ago in detail. But first, let's talk about what's happened this year. This year actually was the year when troubles returned to Boeing. It had more or less kind of come out of the disaster of the MAX crashes, and it was kind of was sort of like stabilizing. Everything was more or less hunky dory, fine. And then you had an Alaska Airlines flight where a part of the fuselage just blew off.
Yeah, the door plug
The
just
door
blew
plug,
out
yeah. So we later
mid-flight.
found out it was a door plug. It was a piece of tech basically where they had a door for emergency rescue in case the plane was operated at its maximum capacity. This case it was not, so they had a door that was plugged. It was done by a third party, but obviously Boeing, being the manufacturer, has the responsibility of ensuring quality checks.
Correct, yeah.
So in this case, you can definitely blame Boeing at some level. Then you had the mysterious deaths of two whistleblowers, one at Boeing and one, I think, at the third party that was involved in the Alaska Airlines door plug issue. The investigations have ruled that the Boeing employee's death was natural. Sorry, was a suicide, while the other death was natural. But again, not a headline that Boeing would have loved. And obviously, we spoke about what happened a couple of days ago. So before we get into the genesis of the issue, which is the Max disaster and the MCAS issue, let's talk about the company right now. How do you picture what's happening at Boeing right now? And elaborate a bit on what you said in the first point about the repercussions for the world, whether it's commercial airlines or military, if things were to go terribly, terribly bad, even worse at Boeing right now.
So let's be very clear. The last few years, ever since the twin Max crashes that took place a few years ago, basically make this Boeing's worst decade in its history of existence. Now, Boeing, very quick recap of what Boeing is. Boeing is a company that is the typical American post-war company. It's a company that built America's greatest bombers. The aircraft that bombed Hiroshima were basically built by Boeing. It continued to build defense aircraft, long after the war, but then became this giant civil aviation company. And as we all know, the world's civil aviation market is dominated. It's a duopoly of Boeing and Airbus. Airbus in Europe, Boeing in the United States. They both dominate that market almost entirely across the world. And Boeing has been a hugely successful company. They've diversified and they've acquired many companies along the way. So they build everything. They're involved obviously in civil aviation, in defense manufacture. They manufacture all manner of military hardware, from aircraft like the C-17 to fighter jets like the F-18, helicopters like the Apache, which we operate, the Chinook. They also are deeply involved in space systems. They have a launch. They have launch systems, which happens to be one of their biggest divisions. Boeing Space is a big division for them. So this is like an old legacy American company that has been built from the ground up. Not just by war entrepreneurship, but also because it was sort of dominated by engineers and a spirit of engineering and pushing the frontiers of technology and in many ways the history of aviation is the history of Boeing. The history of civil aviation is the history of Boeing. They can't be separated. Now, a company that is that large and is in a kind of duopoly with Airbus. Let's keep defense aside for a moment and talk about why Boeing is in this sort of quagmire of negativity right now. Bad headlines is just the tip of the iceberg. Boeing is battling very serious internal issues. It's facing a huge financial crisis as a result of all these incidents. Its stocks have taken a huge hit. There are massive concerns in terms of its financials right now. It has changed, I think, 3 CEOs since the Max crisis, which took place, if I'm not mistaken, in 2017, 2018.
Yes.
The mountain that is left to climb for Boeing to recover its reputation now, and I'll talk about why that reputation has reached this rock bottom level right now in a moment. But it's going to take, most analysts believe that Boeing is going to have to spend the next 1 decade repairing the damage that has been done to its reputation, to its structure, to its to the way the world sees it, to the way passengers see it, to the way Wall Street sees it, to the way the company once was perceived globally. Now, the scope of this podcast can't go into every single detail of how things reached here, but to very quickly tell you where point zero for Boeing's the genesis of Boeing's current problems was the first Boeing 737 MAX crashed. This was a Lion Air
Yes.
aircraft. It crashed off the coast of Indonesia. And just a few months later, an Ethiopian Airlines Boeing 737 MAX, again, brand new aircraft, crashed on its way to Kenya, if I'm not mistaken. So hundreds of passengers lost in a span of a few months by two aircraft where the situation or the circumstances in which those aircraft crashed seemed terrifyingly similar. And the investigation basically found that Boeing had cut corners in order to save costs. It was nervous about transferring those costs, training costs to the airlines. It was something they believed would have been a disincentive, in its competitive race with Airbus. Airbus had basically triggered this entire kind of devilish race to build more efficient aircraft by introducing something called the A320 Neo, which was basically taking the old Airbus A320, tried and tested A320, which everyone has flown at some point of their lives in, and slinging on a pair of new engines, bigger engines that provide a percentage greater degree of efficiency, which may not seem like a big deal to us, but for airlines, it's everything. Every little small sliver of efficiency that airlines can sort of milk out of engines, it's something that's very tempting to them because it accrues to millions of dollars in savings over years and decades. So Airbus had a massive first movers advantage. Boeing couldn't really do the same thing with its Boeing 737. There was talk for a while about whether Boeing would launch a completely new aircraft and, put the 737 to bed. It had a decades of very successful run, one of the most produced aircraft. Everyone has flown in a 737 at some point in their lives. But seeing the market and how it was reacting to the Airbus A320 Neo, Boeing basically decided we don't have the luxury of time. We need to do something now. So they pushed the 737 MAX. They said, let's stay with the 737. It'll save us some time. We will figure out a way to put new engines on this, even though the engineering challenge with the MAX, Dave, was unlike the A320, the Boeing 737 sits a little lower to the tarmac. And therefore, slinging on new engines is a risk because those engines will almost touch the ground. Therefore, they needed to innovate and come up with a new way of putting those engines on. So they had to shift the engines a little forward on the wings and a little higher. So the actual engines were slightly above the wings. Now, it is very critical to remember, and I'll quickly make this point, that Boeing was under huge pressure to ensure that the new MAX was given to airlines and sold to airlines and pitched to airlines as the same 737. Your pilots who are flying the existing 737 can simply hop over to the MAX with no extra cost to the airline. No extra training, no extra simulator, no expensive orientation or conversion training of any kind. It's the same aircraft, just better. We've put better engines. Your pilots can simply jump from this aircraft into that aircraft and everything's be okay. And for the airlines, this was gold. This was awesome. They're like, wow, no training? Great. Which means they get to hit the ground running once the planes arrive. The problem was that when you put the engines slightly forward on the wings, the aircraft behaves differently. When you put the aircraft's front on the 737's wings, especially on the MAX, it tended to pitch the aircraft up, nose up during low speed and takeoff conditions, etc. For which they had basically built in a software patch. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but basically Boeing had put in a software patch to correct the aircraft's nose attitude without telling the companies that they've put that software patch. The reason they did not tell the companies that they had put the software patch is because it would have meant recertification, it would have meant mandatory retraining of pilots on that system, it would have meant declarations of all kinds to the Federal Aviation Authority, to the National Transport Security Board, etc., and to a wide variety of American agencies saying the plane is not the same. It is different. And we've made all these changes. And that would have meant a cost to airlines, which would have meant a disincentive from buying the 737 MAX. You're understanding what I'm saying now. Therefore, Boeing, in effect, slid that under the carpet, saying pilots won't need it. And, if it comes to it, we'll tell pilots about it. Not knowing that this little software patch that they introduced was very, very powerful. If it got wrong readings of what the aircraft was doing, it would kick in and override what the pilot was doing, which is exactly what happened in the Lion Air crash and the Ethiopian Airlines crash. It was something called MCAS, which was Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. MCAS sounds innocuous, sounds kind of fancy, but it was a murderous piece of software that Boeing basically did not tell its pilots about. It was a life and death piece of software that was, ironically built to actually save the plane from a kind of stall situation where it starts falling out of the sky, but ended up being the reason for those aircraft crashing into the ground in both those cases. When that happened, Max aircraft, which were just beginning their market, entry, were all grounded. Then the pandemic hit. Then you had almost a kind of chain reaction of incidents that revealed to the world, to aviation analysts, to the Federal Aviation Authority, that the MAX was probably the first symptom of a larger malaise within Boeing. And we'll get into that as well in your next few questions. But basically what happened was everyone suddenly realized, wait, this isn't a one-off. It's not just the MAX, where faulty decisions like this have been made. This has possibly infected other decision-making chains of command, and a word that companies like Boeing take very seriously, the culture of the company. The culture of the company had changed, and that is every company's worst fear, because culture doesn't change overnight. It changes slowly, it changes insidiously, it changes invisibly, it changes over a decade or 2 decades, so you don't really notice it. Like a frog in a pot of water that's being brought to a boil. The frog will not go away because it doesn't know the water is heating, it's happening so slowly. So the same kind of thing is what analysts say happened to Boeing.
Right. And yeah, I do want to talk about the larger malaise within this company, because I've been following the MAX accidents and the follow-up since they happened. There are a couple of fantastic documentaries on them.
Yes.
I forgot by whom, but we'll have the links in the notes. I'll research after the episode and have a producer put them in the notes. And I've always felt that what happened during the MAX crisis, that first the decision not to tell the pilots, and second the kind of lying that happened even after the first crash, was absolutely criminal. And I think also there was a bit of racism involved, because if you remember, the Indonesian plane had one of the pilots was Indian.
Yes.
And the Ethiopian Airlines flight obviously had an African pilot. So I think there was a bit of racism involved. These guys don't know how to fly the plane.
They tried to blame the pilots initially.
Yeah. But it turned out you had put on a piece of software. It's like, I'm driving my car and my car company has made a change that after 100 kilometers per hour, your brakes will stop working. For you to be able to work your brakes, you have to go into the HUD and press that one button for it to activate. I have no idea about it.
Absolutely.
And suddenly I'm at 100 kilometers per hour and press the brake, nothing's happening. Yeah. What did Boeing have to do? So after all the lying, finally they had to admit, okay, we did, mess up. There will be retraining involved, etc., etc. They paid $2.5 billion in fine. Their CEO was fired. That's it. Why do you think it stopped just at that? Because in my view, I think there should have been much, much harsher penalties imposed on this company to ensure, and for a message to be driven home that what you've done is criminal, and whatever is linked to this culture that has led to this decision needs to be weeded out right now. You should probably cease operations for 2 years, do a sort of a inventory of your entire setup, and then come back a new company. That did not happen. Do you think, slightly philosophical, I guess, but do you think that's because that's just the way the world works, because this company is so deeply entrenched, like you've said, in the entire global aviation system, whether it's commercial or military? Or do you think something more should have definitely been done?
No, look, it's a new world. Even though this is a company that has been described by many as too big to fail and things like that, I think the events of the last few years have proven that Boeing is not immune to a great deal of damage. Now, we can trace Boeing's, the beginning of Boeing's problems, of course, to the MAX. But, when we spoke of culture, and I'll come to culture in a moment, I'll first answer your question about, the troubles that Boeing faces right now. The $2.8 billion that they had to pay as part of that class action suit, in both those crashes is probably only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the, what Boeing will have to suffer. They face criminal investigations at this time. They face very, very deep, Department of Justice investigations in the United States. There are several other agencies that are investigating not just safety aspects, but all manner of things, pertaining to decision making, chain of command, safety, quality control. Basically, Boeing has in effect is being dissected and taken apart to make sure how deep into the system this bad culture has seeped. Now, there's this fabulous book called Air Wars by a man called Scott Hamilton, and I recommend it to anybody who has even a remote interest in in all of these things that we're talking about. But Boeing has always prided itself, Dave, as being a company that is run by engineers, a company where the CEO or the man who's heading the company is an engineer. Even at the time of the Max crashes, the man who was at the helm of Boeing, if I'm not mistaken, it was Dennis Muilenburg.
Yes.
He's a decades old company man of Boeing, a man who began on the shop floor, a man who was a chief engineer on the X-32 fighter program, a man who has been part of many different aviation projects of Boeing, an engineer, a dyed-in-the-wool engineer, a man who rolls up his sleeves, works with blueprints, works with factory workers, technology, and actually builds these things, at one point literally with his own hands. So Boeing's culture was the people who lead this company, the people who run this company, and the people who answer to investors are people who've gotten their hands dirty building these aircraft. Their sweat and blood is literally in these aircraft. So that was something they prided themselves on. That was their culture. Now, in the 1990s, which saw a great deal of corporate consolidation in the United States, there was a company which I'm sure you've heard of, and many of our listeners would have also, called McDonnell Douglas. Yes. McDonnell Douglas, another absolutely iconic American aircraft company. The designer and builder of many amazing iconic aircraft. In service with the U.S. military, including the many different aircraft. This company was basically bought over by Boeing. It was supposed to be a merger, a bit of a troubled merger it was, except that most people think that even though McDonnell Douglas was the smaller company and Boeing was much, much larger, this wasn't really a merger. People thought it was McDonnell Douglas that had taken over Boeing. Mm-hmm. And these two companies had vastly different cultures. Boeing, like I said, its culture was engineering, commitment to safety and superior technology and, innovation first and shop floor and factory and that kind of spirit, which is also why, Dave, Boeing's headquarters used to be Seattle. Yes. Right where its biggest factory is. And I've been to I've had the privilege of being to Boeing Field in Renton, where they have the largest aviation factory in the world. It is eye-watering. Imagine a factory which is 4.5 kilometers square on each side, non-stop, just production lines of the biggest aircraft, people have flown in. Now, McDonnell Douglas had a very different kind of culture. McDonnell Douglas was a contract culture. Ye contract humko jeetna hai. How much more money can we make off this deal? How much value are we generating for our investors? What is Wall Street saying about this deal? That was McDonnell Douglas's culture. And after the merger, the so-called merger of Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, curiously, Boeing decided to shift its headquarters from Seattle, where its factories were, to Chicago, where there was nothing. Chicago is just another big city in the United States. And most people are wondering, why would you do this? You're literally signaling to the world that you're moving the leadership away from where your soul is. And at that time, it didn't seem like a bad thing. They said, no, we're fine. We need to move to bigger offices elsewhere, blah, blah, blah. Chicago, which is, also closer to Washington, easier to access, lobbyists, etc., whatever the reasons were. The fact is, that was a kind of symptom. It showed that culture of McDonnell Douglas had begun to infect Boeing and was changing it from a company that was engineering first to Wall Street first, where safety and things would be given slightly less priority than what the stock price of the company is. They started putting the stock price monitors on their shop floors,
Yes.
which was something Boeing had never done in its history. McDonnell Douglas used to do that. And they started putting that on shop floors. So these little indicators, they've started popping up, showing that something that was very alien to Boeing's way of doing things since the post-war years had started infecting it from the inside. And like I said, it was happening so slowly, people didn't realize that they were hurtling towards what would finally kind of explode with the MAX disaster. And like we've seen after that as well, like in India, when a high-profile rape case is reported, in the media, you will start to see rape cases reported in other parts of the country, it almost like a flurry. It's not like rapes have suddenly started happening. They've been happening all the time. But because of one high-profile incident, other not so high-profile incidents of rape will be picked up by the media, because that's the mood right now. That's the anger. Similarly with Boeing, it's not like problems don't happen with other companies, other airlines, other manufacturers. But because of this negative spotlight on Boeing, because of the glaring questions that the company has been facing for all these years, you've had all these things. And they've had the terrible luck of unavoidable situations like the Singapore Airlines dive happening, and it being a Boeing 777. It could easily have been an Airbus. It like you correctly said, it had nothing to do with the aircraft type. It was a weather situation. But Boeing has just had that run of bad luck. However, it has also demonstrated that the symptoms visible during the MAX disasters are still very prevalent in the system. The door plug exiting showed quality control issues, terrible quality control issues, which have actually attracted a criminal investigation. There are other, a wheel falling off an aircraft.
Yes.
That happened. There are certain other, situations that are being investigated parallelly as well. So all of this means that Boeing basically faces perhaps the biggest reputational and financial crisis of its history.
Right. We'll stay on this topic and also talk a bit about the larger issue of the US government in this case as well, but after a quick break.
But the weather seemed to be pretty bad in those parts, and they were traveling through the jungles. So who gave the clearance and the go-ahead clearing the president's convoy as flight ready in such inclement weather conditions? One. Secondly, it was a convoy of helicopters. There were three. There was one ahead, one behind, and then it was the president's aircraft. The other two have landed safely, and this one was caught in bad turbulence.
I said that why remove someone, which many observers have also said, that who doesn't take the final call, as in he was not the supreme leader, he was the president.
Why are you even assuming for once that any leader of Iran can just be killed within Iran? Mossad can't just take anyone out. If there is an external hand, this could blow up into one of the biggest conflicts of the region, because Iran is then going to take on whoever they think is responsible.
I was just having a conversation with one of my friends, and he was like, "Arey to kya hua? It's just the president, right?" Like there were emotions involved, but I'm just saying that it's just the president, so everything is just going to be very smooth, right?
Like you said, why are they not killing or taking out the supreme leader? Why
Geeta,
just the president?
I'm not advocating.
Not
please.
advocating, but the question, why are they?
Because
it's not that
trust
easy.
me, I have read this.
So, but then, a lot of people say, why aren't they? Because it's not easy. You can't just go, which leader has been killed inside or assassinated inside?
Welcome back. Shiv and I are discussing Boeing, the storied US company that's been in the headlines for all the wrong reasons for the last 3-4 years. We've spent the first half talking about what's led to the current crisis at Boeing, the infamous MAX twin disasters, where Boeing essentially lied to pilots and the worldwide community initially, and then kind of admitted to it as well. I want to talk a bit about the US government now, and that's kind of closely linked to our, general topics that we discuss. And we've talked a couple of times about the US essentially dropping the ball when it comes to top subjects where the world has expected the US regime, no matter who's in power, to be, to ensure everything is right. We spoke about that during the during the Israel Hamas episode and a couple of other occasions as well. I forgot which. Okay, Boeing messed up fabulously. What was the FAA doing? I'm not saying we'll get into sort of an investigation of what the FAA was doing, but remember, this is not a very old aircraft. The MAX, the 737 MAX was, I think, just a year old when these two accidents happened. This was in 17-18, so I'm guessing it was put out in 16 ke aaspas. And it must have been certified in the months before that, so 15. So it's like, maybe 10 years ago. So this is very much the current US regime, so to speak. Not current as in the person in power, but the setup in place. So what is happening with the US that when it comes to stuff that affects the entire world, this country keeps seemingly dropping the ball all the time? Do you share that sentiment as well?
So Boeing has a kind of unique reputation in the United States, Dave, because it's not just a corporate entity, but it's also a kind of a legacy asset of the United States. It's seen as not just this company that churns out aircraft, but also a piece of heritage and pride for Americans, because it's truly the true blue all-American post-war company that a company that sort of was tested by fire during World War II. Provided many of the machines that won the Allied forces many battles and wars, including the final dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. And then it emerged from that, the fires of war, to become this amazing, proud company that was providing thousands upon thousands upon thousands of jobs, to a newborn capitalist society. And therefore, looking at Boeing as just a company, Boeing Inc. is difficult. There is a lot of history and heritage and culture that is attached to how people perceive Boeing. We perceive Boeing as a kind of heritage company here in India. You can imagine how Americans perceive it there. The history of post-war America is inextricably linked with Boeing, because Boeing became big during the war. So once the war ended, Boeing was already huge. And like I said, the history of aviation, the history of many of the things we take so much for granted right now, a quick flight to someplace, were possible because of the innovations by this one company. No matter what anyone is saying about Boeing right now, about the culture issues, about the financial crisis, about Max, and all the diseases that infect this company. This is a company that was and is truly great. It was built by people of vision. It was built by people who saw the future of travel and created a world where people are far better connected than they once were. The US government that you ask about is an amazing question. As Boeing became bigger, like all of the other legacy American companies like General Electric and United Technologies, etc., all of these companies obviously also, by virtue of their size, became hugely influential politically also. By virtue of the enormous number of jobs that they generated, they had outsized economic clout, influence on government. And I don't mean this in a kind of insidious or negative way. Any company, any large business that has a huge amount, that generates a huge amount of jobs, that generates enormous sales and pays massive taxes and has a huge economic contribution to a country, obviously has political influence. And therefore, Boeing in many ways has been seen as the company you cannot touch. The company you cannot, of course, you must hold it to account, but hey, it's Boeing. It's Boeing, it's ours. It's true blue. It's the real American company. Now, I'm not saying Boeing never got into trouble. They've had trouble, but the questions that arise, especially after the MAX aircraft disasters, is exactly the question that you ask. Have they been adequately held up to scrutiny? Were they getting a free pass because of their size and influence? The actually terrifying answer to one bit of your question, which is about the Federal Aviation Authority, is, and this I saw actually in one of the documentaries you mentioned, Dave, is that would you believe that the Federal Aviation Authority is actually populated by people appointed by aviation companies? Either people who are from those companies or people appointed by those companies, which means that the people who are overseeing and regulating you are your own people. It's like you correcting your own examination sheet. It's literally that. I'm not even simplifying it. It is horrific. And it took them. Aviation is not new. Aviation and the Federal Aviation Authority in the United States are decades old. But it took the MAX disaster for the structure of the Federal Aviation Authority to actually come under scrutiny about why is it that people from Boeing or appointed by Boeing are holding the spotlight on Boeing's activities. Isn't that a textbook definition of conflict of interest? Isn't that a textbook definition of, getting away with what you want because it's your people who are overseeing your actions? So when I talk about corporate influence and corporate power, this is not restricted to Boeing. This is true of all big companies with outsized economic influence. But I'm saying the reason why this has become such a big deal, Dave, is because the effects of it, most of the time, for people like us, Dave, the effects of that corporate influence on government or government agencies is not something we experience firsthand. It's not something we might actually feel in our daily lives, etc. Price rise, things like that, those things might happen. In this case, hundreds of people died in crashes. In this case, a door plug blew out of a flight when it was flying, an Alaska Airlines flight. These are things that happen which have a direct, visible, quantifiable effect on human life, and not in some ambiguous way, in a direct way. So if something's wrong with the Boeing aircraft and it crashes, and then you pull up all the FAA documents and you find that the people who've been either ignoring or passing or failing to certify stuff or failing to raise the right questions or failing to red flag stuff are people from that company, what do you do? So, whether this was kid gloves, whether this was corporate influence, whether this was, the US government giving big companies a free pass because of that old, these companies are so big, I'm sure they know what they're doing. Why would Boeing, mess around with things like safety? Imagine someone sitting in the top levels of American government, not having a problem with this conflict of interest as far as the Federal Aviation Authority is concerned, by justifying it in their heads and saying, but it's Boeing. They've been building aircraft since post-war. Why would they do things that would endanger passengers? Because if passengers die, they only will be affected. तो वो नहीं करेंगे ये सब. So let's be cool. I don't think they need so much oversight also. ठीक है. They know these stuff. And then it happened. Because that culture shift is happening insidiously. It's happening slowly. It's happening invisibly. You're not seeing it happen. And when it happens, it's too late. You can't stop a crash. When that plane was diving out of the sky and going into the Java Sea, nobody could say, oh, it's because we bought McDonnell Douglas. It's too late. These things happen in a flash of an instant. And they happen because of a cumulative effect of decades of faulty decisions that just become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. They infect more and more and more and more until it becomes a situation where, apparently, according to some reports now, Boeing's shop floor, its factory floor, used to have an incredible amount of transparency. If someone had a doubt about a part or the quality of a nut or a bolt or a bulkhead or a window or a door or anything, it used to be logged without any fear. Even if it meant delaying the aircraft's delivery, Dev. Even if it meant, and there's an account in this book I mentioned where spotting concerns, factory managers and factory workers were empowered to raise concerns if they were even slightly suspicious about something not being right, even if it meant a 2 or 3 week delay in the delivery of that aircraft to the customer. That would impose a cost on Boeing, but factory workers were empowered and encouraged to raise those things because they knew a cost now, paying a small cost now is much better than a crash happening and paying that cost. And that's a cost on your wallet and your conscience. And we don't want that. And Boeing was intolerant of having that cost. But the culture that had seeped in, apparently, according to the reports, is that so committed was this culture to investors and Wall Street rather than safety and engineering that people were scared to raise doubts or express their concerns about faulty equipment or problems with some parts or anything like that, because they feared that they would be castigated by the higher ups for raising issues that could delay the delivery of the aircraft and therefore impose a cost on the company. So that culture of nothing comes before safety had evaporated. And that's how this happened.
Yeah. It's actually a remarkable story, I think. And I think it'll go on the history books and people will be reading about this for a long, long time.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little about the difference between buying commercial jets versus buying military jets, especially on the point of pilot training, because that's a thought that struck my head when I was kind of planning this episode. Because that was one of the root causes of the MAX crashes, that Boeing did not want airline pilots to have to undergo additional training, because that would involve a lot of money for the airlines and that might kind of hold them back from buying this aircraft. Is that also a factor in military negotiations for jets? Because for example, if the cockpit is vastly different from what your pilots are used to. I mean, there's this, running trend on the internet of, comparing the Boeing and Airbus cockpits, especially the way they operate. I mean, so Airbus has a stick while Boeing has a traditional yoke, and you will have pilots battling it out on the internet, left, right. Like, okay, this is better, that is better.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's an aside. But is pilot training also a factor when it comes to military aircraft negotiations? So, for example, when India was negotiating with France for the Rafale aircraft, was this also a factor? And does it ever play a role in military negotiations?
So it's always plays a part in all negotiations, because the training of pilots is a component of the contract. In all military aircraft contracts, there is always a component for training. So whether India is buying Sukhois or MiG-29s, or in this case Rafales, whatever it is, apart from the fixed cost of the aircraft, there are a number of other additional costs that add to the overall value of the deal. These include the weapons package. I'm just naming the big ones: the weapons package, the training, committed maintenance, availability, guarantees, which means enough spares and maintenance in order to keep a certain percentage of the aircraft constantly in the air, things like that. So, performance linked guarantees, etc., maintenance called PLM. All those costs are always there. So, training, simulation training, pilot training overseas, pilot training in India are always costs to this, and they are a very important part of it. You've got to remember that the difference between military aviation training and civil aviation training is pilots in civil aviation can go to flying schools and learn how to fly those aircraft. And when they get hired by airlines, depending on what aircraft they've already been trained to fly, if it's a slightly different variant, they have to, as regulated by the certification agencies, they might have to undergo a certain amount of additional training in order to be absolutely 100% aligned with this aircraft. So if a pilot is a pilot who has trained or flown on the 737 NG, and if a Boeing 737 Max comes along, it's not like you say, "Arey 737 hi hai, I can fly it, man. It's all good." Now, theoretically, the irony of what I'm saying is Boeing actually had suggested that, which was not true at all. If there is a change in variant, there will always be a certain degree of training. Now, the types of training can be different. It can be something as simple as taking an iPad and doing a classroom, sort of 2-hour classroom training capsule with an instructor who's basically on that iPad telling you where certain things are, and certain flow charts are discussed in terms of how things are different. Very, very minimal conversion training. Or it can be something as complicated as having to sit in a simulator for many days and then take that aircraft for an actual spin in the real world and then be certified to fly that aircraft. So the spectrum of training requirements can vary quite widely. In military training, no third agency trains you. It's always the military that trains you. So India's Rafale pilots are trained by French Rafale pilots. They aren't trained by some other, company or Dassault Aviation or Boeing or anything. They are trained by the military themselves. And then they come here, and those pilots who've been trained then train other pilots. So military training is a very closed affair. Now, you might have companies supplying the components, supplying the simulators, supplying the training packages, etc. But the actual training is done only by military personnel, strictly by military personnel. So that's the difference in training, and it is a crucial component. Like, for example, on the Rafale, the training would have to be from scratch because India has nothing like the Rafale.
Yes.
Now, one might argue that since we have the MiG-29 and the MiG-29s were sent for upgrading, pilots who flew India's old MiG-29s would have to undergo additional training for sure to fly the upgraded MiG-29 because it comes with all new systems. It comes with a new cockpit. It comes with a more powerful radar. It comes with different kinds of panels and displays in the cockpit, which hugely boost and improve the pilot experience in the cockpit. But improve doesn't mean that it's easier. You still have to learn how to do it.
Yeah.
Once you learn how to do it, it takes the workload off you. But that training is 100% crucial. There's, and to answer your question in just one nutshell, there's no way around training. There are no shortcuts to training. It has to happen. Which is why the MCAS 737 MAX, a FOPA by Boeing was so monumental, and in many ways people see it as criminal because you were basically saying no training is necessary when it is clear that training was necessary literally to save lives.
Yeah. Right. As we end this episode, a question on slightly strategic subject. We've spoken about this previously of how when it comes to deciding vendors, deciding which company to go with, especially when they are companies from two different countries, it is finally at the end of the day the call of the Indian government, which also factors in strategic goals and not just what your Air Force requires. So I think you explained in one of our, Air Force episodes, especially when we were discussing how did we choose Rafale over, ironically, the Boeing F-18 for Indian Air Force, is that the Air Force was like, both are capable, we are happy with both. If you give us either of those two, we are fine. And the government takes over, sees paisa kitna hai, kisse dosti banana hai, ya naya banana hai, ya jisse banaya usse jari rakhna hai, and then they make a call, and we went with France. Does something similar also happen in commercial aviation? Because recently you've had Indian Airlines making huge orders. You had Air India, which has recently gone private under the Tatas, placed an order for more than 400 aircraft, I think divided between Airbus and Boeing. Indigo has placed an order also for an equal sum. You have Akasa Air upcoming, is constantly placing orders, etc. So does the government, because I've never seen them involved at all publicly, but is there a backroom hint, nudge sort of a thing ki bhai thoda wahan se bhi kharid lena, thoda wahan se bhi kharid lena?
That's a great question, and it's a very different world in many ways, but it's also very similar. The reason why it's a simpler world is because in the world of civil aviation, bloody hell, there are two companies. I don't know what the percentage is, but I think the airline jets and single aisle and twin aisle aircraft, apart from Boeing and Airbus, there are no other companies. There are smaller companies like Bombardier and other companies that make smaller regional aircraft, etc. But Boeing and Airbus are the big hulk dominating companies. It's a duopoly. It's literally a duopoly. So let's forget about all the other companies. Now, like you said, Indigo has placed an equal order for both. There are many airlines that have that are pure Boeing. There are companies that are pure Airbus. Indigo used to be a pure Airbus company, but it's going both ways now because that's the way the world has to finally work. Because remember, airlines, not just now, all through the years, have been very, very committed to milking as much profit as they possibly can per seat, and which means more efficient engines. The savings over time are vast. So they will go to who's offering a better deal, which is why you see, you'll see airlines ordering 150 jets, and most people who are not acquainted with how these things are done, wondering what the hell are you going to do with 150 jets, not knowing that those 150 jets are going to take 20 years to deliver. It's not like somebody's going to sit there and build 150 Indigo jets in one go and deliver them to you. The Boeing and Airbus are building aircraft for tens of hundreds of customers. So you'll probably get 3 aircraft now, then 5, then more. So it's spread over decades, these deliveries, and the negotiations are extremely aggressive. Boeing and Airbus have been known to run each other into the ground, metaphorically speaking, in terms of price. The price war between these companies I've heard they've been brutal. If you read in Air Wars by Scott Hamilton, they are incredibly competitive. And since this is a civilian sphere, it's actually slightly more open than the military, where things are much more government regulated. Here you've got corporate battles that lead to a great deal of, I'm sure even literal bloodletting. And it brings us back to our, the MAX question as well. The whole proposal by Airbus to bring in the A320neo, Boeing saw that as a real threat to its duopolistic domination. It's 50% domination of that market. They felt that if they did not act fast, Airbus would actually skew that kind of equilibrium that Airbus and Boeing both enjoyed. And therefore, they needed to act fast and offer airlines a similar kind of aircraft. And that was the genesis of that problem. But yeah, absolutely, the negotiations they go down to the wire. Each company would prefer pure airlines. If I remember correctly, one of Boeing's biggest wake up calls and shocks was when American Airlines, which was a pure Boeing company, placed an order for Airbus aircraft.
Yeah.
When that happened, Boeing got the shock of its life. And then they realized the enemy is on our turf. It's not like American Airlines don't have Airbus aircraft. US Airlines do have Airbus aircraft, but this was a pure American Airlines ordering Airbus aircraft. It was like unthinkable for them. And that's when they realized they need to get up and do more. So that's how it works.
Yeah. Right. Let's end this episode there. And I really hope for this company's revival. Of course, I don't think it's going anywhere. It's gonna crash and burn. And
just as a final point, since we've spoken so much about Boeing, Dev, is that this is a company that's populated by incredibly capable people. So I think Boeing will see far better days. In many ways, the too big to fail kind of thing is real, but the damage it has sustained in the last few years is not small. It's substantial, and like I said, it's going to take a decade or more for it to climb out of this pit that it finds itself in. But in many ways, Boeing's the best things about Boeing will save it. The fact that it is a company that has built a legacy of being on the cutting edge of technology, a company that knows how to use its resources to actually better the lives of others. So all these strands of its legacy and culture will most definitely save it. I don't think Boeing should be worried about getting out of this pit. It's just a question of how long it's going to take. Because truly iconic and a company. And my fascination with aviation actually began with the Boeing plane, and I'm guessing people can guess which one. It was the Boeing 747. Queen of the Skies, as it is called. And recently, I think a few weeks ago, we had the last Boeing 747 that was parked at the Bombay airport going out for scrapping, I think, if I'm not wrong. It was an Air India plane. It was sold to a scrap dealer. I'm not sure which one in the US, and it's gone there. And there were nice visuals of it by plane spotters, as they're called. Took off and then did a sort of a jig in the air before saying goodbye to India forever. That's it then. Thanks, Shiv. A refreshing change of topic, I think. Very nicely explained and great chat as always. And a reminder to our viewers and listeners, we'll be gone for 2 weeks. We'll be back on June 13th, which will be a Thursday as always. So till then, you can keep going back to our previous episodes and refresh your memories if you want. Or we'll have some links in the show notes. Actually, we'll do this. We'll sit with Anna and compile some of our favorite episodes of season 2 of In Our Defense. Quarter of a century, by the 25
95 episodes now. So as we go towards the 100th,
And we're just getting started.
yeah. So we'll have a selection of my selection, Shiv's selection, and of course Anna's selection of our best episodes so far in the show notes. Thanks as always to our producer Anna Priyadarshini. That's it for this week's Defense Dose. For more, tune in on June 13th. Till then, stay safe and do not cross any boundaries with a passport. Bye bye.